Hey guys, Spirit of the Law here. I've already talked quite a bit about the Lithuanian unique unit in depth, but in the May patch it had its cost change pretty significantly. So in this one, we'll investigate how that can impact its use. As a quick refresher, the Elite Leitus' stats are pretty similar to the Paladin. It has a bit less HP and one less pierce armor, but of course the Elite Leitus ignores enemy armor when it attacks, effectively giving it 3 or more extra attack in practice. The recent cost change made them go from a more gold-intensive version of the Paladin line into now slightly more food, but much less gold per unit. Even though it is a 10 resource drop in price overall, you could argue this makes them harder to produce in Castle Age, given all of the demands on food for upgrades and villagers if you're on multiple town centers. Gold can be relatively easy to access and stockpile in the mid-game, but in the Imperial Age, the lower gold cost is definitely a positive thing. They're also created even faster now, and you can make 5 Leitus in the same time that 3 Paladins are made, which helps offset the fact that they're created at castles. What I really want to investigate though is how this impacts their value when compared to Paladins, since of course Lithuanians have access to both units. In a head-to-head matchup with equal resources on both sides, we see about half of the Elite Leitus' HP is left against fully upgraded Paladins. Even Frank Paladins can't hold up with equal total resources. The Leitus negating armor is having a big effect here, and it shows the Leitus packs quite a punch. In fact, the stronger the unit they're up against, the more surprising the result often is. Even Teuton Paladins with 7 melee armor, actually make that 0 melee armor, don't stand a chance. But let's see how they compare against some other common units. It may be a generous assumption, but I'm going to assume you get 2 relics for all of my tests, giving +2 attack to both the Leitus and Paladin. Collecting relics as Lithuanians is a big part of the game plan, so I'll give the player credit for doing an okay job at that. Just keep in mind they won't do quite as well as shown if you completely ignore relics. To start, with equal numbers against fully upgraded heavy camels, both Paladins and Elite Leitus lose slightly, with almost identical damage done to the camels. The difference is the Leitus lower gold cost makes them trade equally for gold in the long run. That's pretty good, considering the camel is a common counter against cavalry, and the Paladin in comparison loses 50% more gold over time. In more extreme cases, like against the Imperial camel, the camels will have fewer losses over time, but still, the Leitus holds up fairly well. In fact, it starts to make me wonder how they compare against trash units long term. It turns out when slightly outnumbered by halberdiers, the Paladin is more population efficient, but definitely loses in total resources over time. Even in a team game where gold is relatively easy to obtain, I think it's fair to say halberdiers are going to be long-term cost effective. That's not necessarily true against the Leitus though, which trades about equally in total resources. That's now 2 Paladin counters that don't give clear value against the Elite Leitus. In fact, there's a strange possibility that Leitus are so gold efficient, they're effective in post-imp trash fights. For example, when slightly outnumbered by Hussars, the Hussars' total losses are about 5 to 1. I thought the Leitus would do well, but definitely not that well. After crunching the numbers, even accounting for bottomed out market prices at 14 gold per 100 food, you get better value selling food to make Leitus than you are making Hussars. Even with 0 relics, it's pretty much equal value lost on both sides, and again, this is with the Hussars outnumbering the Leitus. Considering Leitus benefit from relics and Hussars don't, I think if you have any relics, you're fine to mix in Leitus with your Hussars when you run out of gold, as strange as that sounds. Obviously, that's assuming you have the castles to do so. On the other hand, the same can't be said about the Paladin, and they end up with a food deficit when going the market selling route, as most gold units should, highlighting how unusual this makes the Leitus now. To take this to the extreme, what about against the Elite Magyar Hussar though, with its 80 food cost? Well, with equal resources on both sides, giving the Hussar a massive advantage thanks to Lanchester's square law, the Elite Leitus comes out on top. Of course, that's treating gold equal to food, which isn't always a fair assumption, and with a more reasonable numbers advantage for the Magyar Hussar, the Elite Leitus can't keep up by selling food at the market for gold. So at least the Magyar Hussar still has an edge in trash fights, as I think it should. So what about their value against champions? Champions have a low gold cost, so they're also contenders to produce by selling food at the market. Previously, Leitus would have been losing to champions in terms of gold over time, but the new cost adjustment means they now win that exchange in the long run. For me, it really highlights how much that 30 gold reduction does to change the unit's balance. So do Knights and Paladins ever make sense to create for Lithuanians? Well, I'd argue in the Castle Age, it's a bit harder to mass Leitus now because of the higher food cost, and of course the fact you need 650 stone for a castle. I don't think they're so overwhelming in the mid-game that you need to beeline for a castle, like you would with some other unique units. They also have a pretty large drawback in the late game, which is how they do against ranged units. Paladins take 60 shots from an Arbalest, whereas in contrast, the Elite Lytus only takes 38. Remember, they're missing out on 30 extra HP and 1 Pierce Armor, so Paladins still perform better when raiding. That said, anytime melee fighting is involved, the Lytus is looking better than ever, and are significantly faster to mass. Overall, it seems like a significant buff to the unit, bordering possibly on too cheap now, since its low gold cost can theoretically be exploited in trash fights. But that's all for this one. Special thanks to Samantha, Jean-Paul, Joseph, and Connor, as well as everyone else on Patreon and YouTube for continuing to support me and what I do. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.